Good afternoon. I'm here in the San Francisco Botanical Gardens. And there's a lot of activity here. Although at our scale, at the macro scale, the scale we live at, a lot of the activity is invisible because it's happening in other temporalities, at other speeds. So we do not see the very sophisticated and actually, in its own way, rapid growth of the plants. What's happening in the plants is distributed over a vast, compared to my body anyway, a relatively vast physical embodiment, some of which is invisible because it's under the ground. Now, these animals exist at close to our scale, so their temporality is intelligible to us. They're not moving so quickly that they appear to be a blur, and they're not moving so slowly that to us they appear to be still. So they are existing near our own temporality, and yet what comprises a lifespan for them is very different from what comprises a lifespan in our understanding and expectation. Now, of course, I think it's very important to carefully consider that each living being is unique and is distinct from our ideas about it. It's distinct from our expectations, because most of our ideas and expectations come from norms. These are generalizations over classes of phenomena, processes, beings, environments, and so on. And these generalizations, while useful in some domains of our human thinking and pragmatic or utilitarian orientations, these generalizations we use all the time in our thought and in our science and in statistics and in making predictions and so on, can be extremely deceptive when we move from the class of beings or phenomenon to an instance, an individual. This is a fascinating thing to remain aware of, and as a cognitive activist, it's the kind of thing that I'm particularly interested in. What kind of thing do I mean? I mean the difference between our generalizations, our norms, our expectations of phenomena, and the actual uniqueness of a given being or situation or circumstance or question, when that question becomes about a specific array of related events. Part of why it's fascinating is because the generalizations can be very deceptive. And what brought this to mind for me was the idea that we have a lifespan, that there's an expected span of life for an animal or a human being. That span is generated from norms. And it's a generalization. Some human beings die before they're born. Some human beings die shortly after they are born. Some human beings die in childhood, some in their teens. So what we sort of mean by a lifespan in human terms is, barring what we would consider to be misadventure, which is a strange word in and of itself, since our life is, and our death, these things are so mysterious, it's very difficult to understand what would comprise misadventure. Yet we have a normal meaning for this word. So every life, every being, every seed, every bird, every dog, every bacterium, every form of life, while it resembles the class, the generalization that we conceptually apply to it, and this is an overlay on our direct experience. None of us can directly see bacteria. And we know these plants are growing, but they're doing it at a rate in a way that's not ordinarily detectable to us. Technologies can render it detectable. And similarly with technologies, we can see bacteria. We can also see into the development of processes and relationships that are otherwise ordinarily invisible to us. The expectation that things will be normal is a very peculiar one and a dangerous one for many of us, that comes not only from language but from culture. And I have to admit that although I am a biophile and an ethnophile, and I love diversity, actually I just love I love so many fascinating aspects of the living planet and world. And I'm even an anthrophile. I love human beings. But I'm also phobic about many aspects of our culture, our societies, our technologies. Lots of these things I'm ambivalent about, meaning I have more than one feeling. So that while I can appreciate the seeming mechanical perfection of a smartphone or a jet fighter, I largely abhor their existence, and automobiles and so on and so forth. Because to me they represent a vast misapprehension of the nature, purposes, and necessities of living as a human being and being in the living world, relationally, with integrity and awareness. So I'm conflicted. It's not necessarily true that I'm hypocritical, although it's relatively easy to see me this way, because, for example, I'm using this device to communicate with you. to share in the life of the mind, the soul, and the imagination. I think here we probably have a coyote dig, though another animal, conceivably a skunk or possibly a raccoon, could have made that dig. This is a buckeye that we might imagine is sleeping right now. We call it a buckeye because it produces large seed bodies that could be understood to resemble the eye of a deer. And noticing that name answers a question for me. A friend of mine and I, Ryan Heavyhead, were in the children's garden here a couple of weeks ago. And we found some things that resembled chestnuts. And we were curious about them, what they were. And now, just because of the name of that tree, I think I know. I think I know what humans around here call them. Does that tell me what they are? Does knowing their name tell me what they are? No. It links them to a couple of classes. It links them to the class of something, a unique thing, things we can refer to in language, and there are things that aren't in that class. Organisms, vegetation, trees, seeds, fruit. There's other ways we can classify them, but you see that to get to the concept or name or whatness of a thing in language, we have to traverse a tree that goes from everything to something to a class to a subclass, and so on. I can hear and see a variety of avians, birds. Having that word doesn't really help me know what they are. What happens is, well, all kinds of different things happen with humans and language. There is no simple generalization for this, but it's both very profound and sophisticated and useful, and at the same time very dangerous and confusing and blinding. Our relationships with language and knowledge do not merely reveal the facets of our experience to us, they also hide them beneath a veil of codes and representations and theories and ideas and concepts and noises we can make with our face or write in letters with our hands or our machines. So we have these generalizations, classes of things, beings, processes, phenomena, ideas, tropes, cliches. And we transmit them from generation to generation. Each of us uniquely encounters the manifold of human representational consciousness in our lives. And we each uniquely encounter and experience and relate with the living world, the universe, the sky, the seasons, the sun, the moon, the stars, ideas, waking life, dreaming life, goals, aspirations, suffering, illness, injury, love, anguish, fear, hatred, desire, confusion, isolation, communion. And one of the reasons that norms are problematical for us is that as human beings, we're social animals. And there's an emotional interiority to each of us that changes based on our situation and lifespan, over the span of our lives. But is highly responsive both to our perceived relationships with others and our imagined possible relationships with others. And so we have, most of us, something often referred to as an inner critic. And the inner critic can be thought of as an amalgam of the imagined thoughts, perceptions, and expectations, not necessarily of actual others, though those may be included. For example, authorities in our childhood, people who were important during our development, our parents, our relatives, our siblings, and so on. But also imaginary others, possible others. What would most people think is an imaginal catalyst for the possibility of inner criticism. And many of us struggle with this so severely throughout our lifetimes that we are often in agony or misery or fear or anxiety because we suspect that something's wrong. Not so much necessarily in our own interiority, but in the relationship between our own interiority and the expectations of authorized or critical others, doctors, judges, parental figures, and so on. And this is very tragic and painful for many of us. And nearly all of us will experience some degree of this suffering, where we will feel where aspects of our own psyche will direct themselves against other aspects of our native interiority, our unique interiority, and focus painful judgments toward them. I've known people who suffer so severely from this that in conversation they have to struggle to produce a sentence because critical reflections are seething up from their subconscious and unconscious and conscious psyche, so that it doesn't even seem reasonable or possible for them to emit language that doesn't immediately invoke judgment. And again, much of this judgment is imaginary. Much of our fear in life is about things that aren't real, that we'll never experience, or is comprised of reflections of previous experience that are no longer relevant or relative to our current situation. And so the idea of norms generates in the human psyche, again, I'm using a generalization there, right? Because this is going to be unique in every moment of every human, of every psyche, if there even is such a thing as a psyche. And I'm getting near what I originally wanted to speak about, but I'm approaching it in spirals at the moment. And there, by the way, is the gentle intrusion of my own critic, or my own critical concern. I had a plan, I'm not sticking to it. Is my oration properly organized? Am I disorganized? Would someone else see this as disorganized? Would they be critical? Am I pleased with the aspect of myself that determines whether or not what I am doing is being done well? Now, some of that's very useful because when it's gentle, when it's gently directed, that aspect of concern about, for example, I'll use the word quality, the quality of my activity or behavior or making, creativity. When the critic is gentle, it both encourages me to proceed and reveals to me aspects of opportunity for me to improve, to make something that I already think is relatively good even better. Now, here we come to the fundamental division, which is between good and bad, as if these were necessarily implicit qualities associated with all possible reference. But they're not. Once we learn to divide the world, particularly conceptually, into good and bad, we have a trap for the psyche, for our intelligence, for our emotions, for our narratological consciousness, the consciousness that tells stories about what's going on in our lives. That one thing, that one dichotomy, good and bad, is the source of much of our emotional and psychic and mental anguish. Am I good or not? Is the fundamental question. Am I doing well or not? Is the fundamental question around which the critical aspect of awareness is orbiting the receptive aspect of awareness, and these two are reflecting back and forth in a relationship. As if there were a kind of psychic satellite, yeah? But it's orbiting something. What is that something? And we could say, our identity, our personality, our being, our essence, our mind, our concern. The last one is relatively good. It's orbiting our concern, in a sense. What we've become momentarily compelled by, our compulsion. But it can orbit other things like our inspiration, our creativity, our humanity, our masculinity, our femininity, our intrinsic belongingness to the humans and norms, or our otherness, our allowness to humans and norms. So the idea of doing well is generated, the character of our experience of whether we are doing well or not at something is generated by a vast array, and maybe a multi-dimensional array, of historical experiences, concerns, habits, so that there's a degree of it that feels relatively there's a degree of it that feels relatively comfortable and useful. And then there are degrees that feel wonderful and ecstatic. There are forms anyway, if not degrees. And there are degrees and forms that feel miserable and agonizing and frightening, depersonating us. So some positive evaluations and judgments and so on of our interiority, our being, our self, are encouraging and reassuring. And it's very joyful to share these together. I think it's important to remind each other to be siblings to each other, to be parents to each other, to be grandparents to each other, when, of course, everyone agrees about this. To be kind and gentle and generous and beautiful siblings and peers and parents and teammates and tribe mates and so on. But then there's the other side of that. The side where we're motivated to criticize or attack, refute, reject. And I think this is where much of our turmoil comes from. Many of us are rarely receiving healthy, nurturing, positive feedback in the social and cultural world. And some number of us are sort of crippled in a way by not even needing to be rejected by any particular external other. We've interiorized negatively oriented others, and inside ourselves we have this circle of vicious critics and judges that are imaginal forms of what if, what would other people think, what would so-and-so think. Of course, most of the time, the vast majority of other people are not thinking about us, right? 99.999%, they're not thinking about us. But we imagine what normal, quote-unquote, people would think. And here's where the generalization gets weird, because there really aren't any normal people. We might be able to say there's normative behavior. We can observe normative behavior that sort of falls in the middle of the range of possible behaviors. But even that, the idea that that's normal or good is really worth questioning deeply. Yeah? There's no reason to believe that normative behavior is ordinary or good, except that it matches a statistical gradient, right? And even that statistical gradient can be misfounded, because what we will derive from statistics as normal will depend upon our concerns and purposes in deriving data from observation. Yeah? And this is very important to understand this. When we derive data from observation, we're collapsing incredibly complex phenomenon into a tiny amount of a relatively modest little array of variables, some of which we get wrong. We being a really weird generalization. What I mean is analysts, right? People doing the analysis. So once again, we can see that the generalization is weird. And if it weren't weird, if our generalizations were actually good, we'd be able to really accurately predict what would happen to an individual. Not to a group, which is what statistics applies to primarily, but to an individual. And this is where perhaps I will begin to speak a little bit. I have to consider it now. I've established a path accidentally today that I wasn't intending to. And now I have to decide whether I should continue along the path that I'm on or switch to the path I had planned. And I don't know what to do. So, I'm going to circle back to the beginning, to where I began speaking, and just notice that the actual life experience of a given organism is wildly unpredictable. The fact that a human egg can be fertilized does not mean it will be born. The fact that it is born does not mean it will survive. The fact that it survives birth does not mean it will survive its first year, the first day of its second year, so on and so forth. We don't know. There's an incredible profusion of mystery about every aspect of existence and identity. To be born as a human being is a situation fraught with mystery, opportunity, suffering, all of the features of existence that we are all uniquely familiar with. And we have these ideas about norms, but when you look, those are clusters. Those are clusters within a storm of incredible diversity. And I think we should be able to flip our perspective over so that diversity has precedence, right? If we do that, suddenly the critics are voiceless, for they know nothing of diversity. Most of them. They are the produce of the idea that things should match norms. By the way, things should. As if there's some extrinsic authority imposing form on phenomenon. And when form escape that imposition, they're bad or wrong. And one of the things that's really interesting about whether something is good or bad is that this idea, which is one of the most dangerous ideas we'll ever encounter, and one could argue that one of the fundamental problems for human consciousness is framed in the story in the English Bible of Genesis and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Apparently everything was going pretty well until at some point one of the original gender pair of human beings approached a very special tree that they apparently had been admonished to neither approach nor touch nor eat from. Now, this is a very complex story, and it's a story that I'll save most of my exploration of for another time. But this tree is supposed to be in the midst of the Garden of Eden. And that midst kind of means in the between. It's in the between of all things. Yeah. And if you go into the between of all things and you make a cut, and you say, these things are on that side of the cut, these other things are on this side of the cut, this side is good, that side is evil, well, now you're in, boy, are you in trouble. You're in a problem. Now, ordinarily, we are trained to evaluate phenomena, whether they're good or not, a lot by feelings. Does it feel good? Does it not feel good? Does it hurt? Does it help? Is it nourishing? Is it toxic? Is it gentle? Is it harsh? Do you feel more alive, or do you feel like you're being killed? And all of these criteria are relatively natural to our minds and humanity. And yet, there's a problem with good and evil for human beings. And the problem is really significant and important if we want to understand something fundamental about the nature of good and evil. If we want to clarify a bit this ancient problem for us. And by the way, after we discover good and evil, things go all wonky for human beings, according to, this story in the Bible, which is probably actually a fragment of a really ancient story. And there's lots of reflections of very similar stories in indigenous cultures that had nothing to do with the Bible at all. Though not all cultures have a story about the introduction of good and evil. Many of them I have heard stories like this, many of them I have not. But one of the most profound features of this conflict the crows and ravens are harassing a hawk. And the camera probably won't reveal this very well. But this is almost a perfect trope. The black corvids appear to have decided that the brown raptor is bad. Or at least shouldn't be allowed to just be where it is, although it was a brief harassment and they left pretty quick. And there's some other crows and ravens around who they have alerted about the location of the hawk, probably a red tail. But then they just kind of went off to do their own thing. That probably means that, there's lots of things it could possibly mean, millions of them. But one of the ways that I think about what I just witnessed is that the specific location of the hawk is not particularly a problem. It's not in one of their roost trees, it's not in a tree that's in their territory, so to speak, or territory they understand that they should be protective of. And so really, they primarily let the hawk know that we know you're there, and they let each other know that there's a hawk nearby. And then they kind of went on to do whatever they needed to do. I've seen this behavior many times. So one of the fundamental features of the good and evil dichotomy, something that we don't usually think of when trying to understand whether whether we perceive something as good or evil, good or bad, so on and so forth, is time. Most of us, I suspect, there's a vast generalization there, I met very, very few people who would claim or could demonstrate that they can see into time. Time is the dimension in which our perception is extremely limited. It's limited to right now. There are, as you go forward from right now, presuming that there's a forward and backward in time, which I think probably is deceptive, but it's a natural result of our common orientation and thinking about time. And I do believe that it's possible for human beings to see into time the way we see into space. I can see what is ahead of me right now if I continue on this path, but if I turn, what is ahead of me changes. Yeah? So whichever direction I turn in determines what is ahead. Huh? And there must be some corollary to this peculiarity in our relationship with time, I think. And I suspect it's possible for human beings to see into time. I also suspect it's very dangerous for a number of reasons that I won't here elaborate on. One of which I'll mention is that it can generate feedback of a peculiar kind that can be very difficult to handle cognitively. But because we can't see into time, it's very difficult to tell whether an event is good or bad. We can tell in the moment that we don't like it, or that we would not want it to happen. We would not choose it this way. We would not like it. But we can't tell what the sequelae, what the consequences will be for anything that we judge as good or bad. At least in only a very small subset of cases is it likely that we can determine whether something is fundamentally good or bad. And again, good is associated with life-giving. Bad is associated with life-removing, right? In general. So because we cannot see into time, we cannot tell what the ontological outcomes of an event are. Surely I do not wish to be injured. Yet, if I am injured, it changes my life path. Right? And many of us drive vehicles, and at least in the United States, because we drive vehicles, we are subject to traffic signals. Every one of those changes where we will be at what time in the future. One could imagine that our lives are actually composed by our relationships with traffic signals, if one were so disposed. And it's not entirely untrue. It's just not the only thing going on. But it's certainly a very weird and important one, because if my parents had not been subject to the very specific traffic signals that they were subject to, it's very difficult to imagine them meeting, right? So am I the result of the activity of my parents' interactions with traffic signals? It's hard to say no, but that's not the only variable. It's just a really important one. And I find that a kind of terrifying thought, right? It's not only terrifying. We can choose our orientation and our purpose in examining it. But it's a really weird idea. The traffic signals determine which eggs get fertilized and by whom, and so on, in human beings, right? I once wrote with a friend of mine, Gary Paolini, we together composed this story about a man who had noticed this phenomenon and used to go to the traffic signal every day to read the future. It was called Traffic Signal Man. And it was composed, we improvised the composition over about an hour and recorded it, and I think there's actually a recording of it somewhere on a cassette tape in my special cassette box. We are particularly susceptible to signals. I can hear the signal of a machine. There. You see? Once the signal was established and began rhythmically reproducing, I expected it to continue. The moment that I noticed it, it disappeared. Is that good? Is it bad? I don't like that signal. I'm not partial to having the noises and effects of machines intrude upon my senses, my sensorium. I don't like them. I'm mechanophobic in that sense. And I'd like to avoid them in general. But there are exceptions. So are machines bad? We make evaluations primarily based on habits. Okay, another similar signal. By the way, those are both the signals of car alarms, right? So someone's machine is in a state where it's been programmed to produce an alarm because it has been disturbed. The idea being that the alarm will drive off thieves and alert others who might be protective of the machine. When I first moved to San Francisco, it was extremely common to be awakened at 2, 3, 4, 5 in the morning by car alarms, not just one, many of them, just going off and going off and going off. And that was bad. Now, it could be that there were results of that happening that were important. I can't tell for sure. The knowledge of good and evil is at best incomplete. But we should be aware we should be aware that because we cannot see into time, determining whether a specific thing is good or bad is profoundly difficult, if not impossible. That doesn't mean that the temporally local felt sense of goodness or badness should be doubted. But the intrinsic sense should be questioned in many cases. I think it's useful. We know, for example, placing food in my mouth, I can tell, is it too hot? Is it hurting me? Immediately, that's a felt sense of, if it's too hot, that's a felt sense of, I need to change my relationship. I might have to spit the food out. And if it's not hot enough, that could also represent a problem if I choose to approach it that way. It's very complex, but I do want us to be aware that the intrinsic goodness or badness of some specific event is probably a myth. We can't tell because we can't see the future. We can't see the sequelae. We can't see the consequences. And something that initially seems bad, something we would absolutely avoid, could turn out to be profoundly fortunate. This same bird was in this same place yesterday, eating worms, at right around this same time. Had the car alarm not continued, if the car alarm had not continued, I would have been on a different path and I would not have seen this bird here today. it's hunting worms because the worms are easily available in the very moist grass, but it could be eating other things as well, not merely worms. I think it's clear that the grass is moist because the bird is shaking its face when how close will it let the humans approach? Not terribly. Although much closer than I thought.
Did you grab everything? Careful, we're gonna go now, okay?
Had the car alarm not continued, I'd have been on another path. And eventually I became concerned because I don't want to disturb those people who are watching my video with 2 or 3 minutes of blaring car alarm. So I changed my path, but right when I changed my path, the car whose alarm was going off began to move. Previously it had not been moving. So someone was driving a car whose alarm was going off. And just as I changed my path, the origin of the alarm began to move and soon departed my proximity. None of this was predictable to me. Was it normal? Well, we'd have to survey a whole bunch of car alarm situations to determine that question, but then what we would find out would be about the cluster, qualities of clusters rather than the specific situation. Was it good or bad? Again, the specific situation and the cluster reveal different windows into whether it was a positive thing or a negative thing. And our orientation in thought and felt sense and perspective and purpose are crucially important in the process of making a determination. For those of us who have and experience very troubling inner criticism, we may have learned to expect cruel or depersonating, painful judgment from someone or some organization whom we needed to have a positive relationship with in order to be healthy. And eventually, when this goes on long enough, or if it starts early enough in our lives, we begin to mirror it in the sense that we form inward psychic organs that take on this role. And that can be tragic and painful and vicious. Similarly, when we receive positive feedback and evaluation and praise and reassurance and inspiration, we may similarly form psychic organs that produce that feedback even in the absence of their existence in our external world and relationships. I was largely lucky enough to be in the latter group, though we all will undergo transformations in these aspects of our interiority as we proceed through our lifespan and into and out of new relationships, social opportunity and isolation, and so on and so forth. Analysts are generally concerned with norms. They want to know what is common, what is uncommon, and maybe even get some numbers about that. But when they get those numbers, their concerns and purposes will determine what statistics they derive, what elements they examine, how they examine those elements, so on and so forth. So perspective and orientation are not just involved in determining what is good or bad, but also what we think of as true, normal, or reasonable to expect. When we become aware of this, consciously, when we become consciously aware of the things I've been circling, then we have new opportunities to see through the blinding aspects of our representational heritage in language and concepts and models and methods, expectations, norms, generalizations. Once we can see through that, our consciousness rises above it in precedence. And that's really important, because in that moment, we cease to be merely subject to the results of all of this behavior over human time and history. And we can now be selective, intentionally, consciously, creatively, in our interiority, in our inner selves, and in our relationships. We can become selective about those features that we would like to include and those features that we would like to reduce the precedence of, the authority of. We can decide which aspects we want to catalyze in our awareness, and fertilize and pursue, and which aspects we'd like to, we might be better off allowing to drop away or to fall away, or seeing for what they are, right? That these are not, it's not true that I am bad simply because there's some echoey voice of a mean authority in my mind that's calling me names or judging me. I can stop feeding that cycle, right, that produces that signal. Right? Or I can turn, right? I can reorient in such a way that that signal is not in front of me, but behind me. Right? It's gone. It's going away. And I think we would all prefer to have the clarity of insight that arises when we move our minds and our sense of personhood and our interiority above all of these abstractions and generalizations and possible judgments of possible others or possible societies, imaginary critics. Though, on the other hand, as I move the camera to my other hand, we might want to encourage and fertilize the voices in our interiority that are positive and reassuring, praising, and whose purposes we trust to be good and true, healthful and wholesome. Even bearing in mind that the acute division between good and evil, good and bad, is deceptive because we can't see into time, even bearing that in mind. Nonetheless, we can still tell whether food's too hot in my mouth right now or food's too cold in my mouth right now. Not that hot and cold necessarily represent good and evil. Essentially, in that model, what I'm saying is that sudden extreme changes are very difficult for organisms like us in the temporalities we exist in the temporalities native to our consciousness and our size and our form and such. Sudden radical transformations, usually experienced as danger, although not always. Some of them are desirable. And in fact, if the food is too hot suddenly in my mouth, the sudden radical transformation of getting it out of my mouth is important. When I first entered the garden, it struck me I had an entirely different topic in mind. But I was looking at the trees, and it struck me that they're deeply rooted in the earth, in what we might imagine as the materia, the prima materia of the world, soil. But their branches, many of their branches are way up in the sky, in the domain we associate with origin and spirit, and even the non-physical. And that was related to the topic I originally had planned to explore today. And it's entirely acceptable to me that I didn't get anywhere near it. But the garden here is beautiful, and I have greatly enjoyed exploring these ideas and perspectives with you today. And I'm profoundly grateful for those of you who have chosen to walk with me in your thoughts and time in your life, and given the gift of your attention. And I would love to hear your comments, suggestions, ideas, concerns, questions. So please feel free to chime in. Even though I realize that in our modern context of short attention span theater, SAST, very few of you will probably ever get near the end of this video. Nonetheless, I'm grateful. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to exploring some of the fascinating depths of our humanity, our conceptual heritage, and the non-verbally capturable essences that are deeply associated with our minds and being in the world. Bye-bye for now.